Continuing from the previous part, Ja-in's spirit and strength have somewhat returned. Back in South Korea, information about the eruption of Mount Baekdu and the significant damage it caused to Seoul has been widely disseminated. However, the disaster is not yet over. With the volcano spewing into South Korea, widespread advisories have been issued, urging people to seal off their homes from outside air and limit outdoor exposure. Additionally, in case of unavoidable outdoor travel, citizens are advised to wear gas masks and respirators for safety. Amidst the chaos, many people are flocking to the White House to protest. Despite the risks to their health and lives, they are willing to gamble for the chance to overthrow the autocratic regime of Seo-young. Despite the condemnation from the populace, Seo-young and her cohorts believe this is a natural disaster and not anyone's fault. Thus, Seo-young and her cronies seem unfazed by the protests. The only thing on Seo-young's sinister mind right now is Ja-in's current whereabouts. Receiving a response from Seo-young's lackey that Ja-in is no longer on Red Island because he is heading straight to South Korea, Seo-young realizes that the voice sounds familiar. It's Lee Soo, the puppet master of Steer. Now, within the White House, the nerve center of the nation, Seo-young is puzzled as to how someone as ordinary as Lee Soo could infiltrate her domain. Consequently, from this moment forward, the order within will shift. As per Steer's plan, the war will begin in South Korea, with Seo-dong, who has long been infected by Steer, becoming its puppet. Promptly, the United Government Summit convened with 197 member nations to discuss pressing matters. The agenda revolves around the Korean peninsula, the eruption of Mount Baekdu, the transformation of Red Island into a battlefield, and Ja-in, a mysterious creature with immense power. South Korea's recent withdrawal from the International Government Union and its declaration of invasion against the North further exacerbate tensions. China, allied with North Korea, warned South Korea against any military provocation towards the North, threatening intervention. The world is on edge. Many politicians suspect that the South Korean government may be under Steer's control. However, Ja-in's monstrous presence complicates matters further. Although other nations desire to prevent this war, the recent images from Red Island make their aspirations nearly impossible. Therefore, to clarify matters, the chairperson of the summit calls for silence to initiate a decisive vote. Of the 197 member nations, 180 agree to the decision. If South Korea crosses the 38th parallel and launches a war of aggression against the North, the International Government Union will mobilize all its forces to stop South Korea for the sake of world peace. The previously somber atmosphere now turns even darker. At this moment, the populace is abuzz with rumors that the International Government Union troops are amassing along the coastal borders, seemingly preparing to intervene in South Korea. Many protesters fear that any slight provocation from South Korea towards the North will result in immediate retaliation. Nevertheless, the majority of protesters still hold on to the hope that, no matter how deranged Seo-young may be, given the current dire threats, she will not issue the order to attack the North, a decision even Steer might reconsider. However, Seo-young does issue the attack order, and on the opposing side, Steer's manipulation, holding the chairmanship of the International Government Union, ensures that the government executes the plan to ravage South Korea according to the virus's malevolent scheme. Not long after, from above the clouds, the artillery shells began to rain down on the territory of South Korea. Needless to say, the country was undergoing the most horrific devastation it had ever seen. Amidst this scene of despair, the one rejoicing the most was Steer. It laughed gleefully because, after all, war would bring about the annihilation of humanity, something Steer had long desired to witness. However, beneath its laughter lay a profound inner turmoil. Steer thought it had complete control over Lee Soo. Yet, when Steer opened its eyes and looked straight into the mirror, it was utterly surprised to find tears still lingering behind its smile. The resistance from Lee Soo seemed stronger than anticipated. To be sure, Steer brought Lee Soo's face closer to the mirror to scrutinize whether there was any chance of a reversal. For Steer, everything seemed to become more intriguing. But interesting in a way that Seo-young couldn't bear. Seo-young, despite her vomiting and retching, was still being manipulated by Steer. From Steer's perspective, having read Seo-young's diary, it knew the play to save the country from the monster Ja-in and for Lee Soo to become Seo-young's national hero. Ironically, it was Seo-young's greed that now led to the sounds of bombing echoing fiercely across the country, claiming countless innocent lives. After all, Steer wanted Seo-young to taste the loss as her comrades fell, not just on the soil of South Korea, but across the world. Outside, the onslaught showed no signs of abating. Many homes lay in ruins, bodies piled up. Now, South Korea was nothing but a landscape of sorrow. If it weren't the sound of bombs, it was the cries and screams of helplessness as people lost their families, regardless of age or gender. Under Steer's hand, this land was gradually transforming into a true hell on Earth. In a corner of the city, as the radio broadcast urged everyone to evacuate, Donald had resigned herself to her fate. For Donald, everything felt like a nightmare. If this continued, South Korea would collapse, and Donald would also perish from Earth. In a moment of despair, a car suddenly pulled up outside Donald's cafe and abruptly stopped. Even though she didn't know who was outside, the area around Donald's cafe would be the next target for bombing, so it was too late for her to evacuate. Just when all hope for survival seemed to have vanished, a new glimmer of hope emerged. Looking up at the sky, Donald was astonished to see countless birds flying around her cafe for a moment. Donald was shocked again when she saw a familiar figure. However, because the person was still some distance away, Donald didn't recognize Ja-in yet. Thus, to Donald's surprise, Ja-in smashed through the glass door and flew straight into her cafe. Donald still hadn't recognized her friend. Everything happened too fast, and she hadn't fully processed it when someone suddenly fell from the sky. It was only when Lee-Su's beloved dog broke free from Donald's embrace and happily ran to Ja-in that she realized it wasn't a stranger but her friend Ja-in. Donald was deeply bewildered because she couldn't fathom how Ja-in had come to her place. Now wasn't the time to be bewildered, so outside, little Okja honked the horn to signal Ja-in. Given the tense situation, as soon as he heard the horn, Ja-in immediately asked Donald to leave with him. Moved by Ja-in's courageous return to save her, Donald couldn't hold back her tears after everything. Since Lee-Su and Ja-in left, Donald had been enduring everything on her own. Despite being just an ordinary girl who could die at any moment, she stayed. She waited for the day she could reunite with her friends. Finally, after days of waiting, the burden in Donald's heart was lifted. Therefore, she burst into tears like a child in the arms of her friend. Not far from Ja-in's place, Steer had finally waited for the author's son to arrive in South Korea. After pondering for a while, Steer looked at itself through the mirror. Shortly after, for some unknown reason, Steer ordered the government forces to cease bombing. Many soldiers from the United Nations had to stop, although they didn't know why. Steer began to question whether its manipulation of humans was starting to affect itself. However, when Steer remembered being punched by Ja-in before, this action wasn't so incomprehensible, as it was simply trying to toy with its opponent, just as Ja-in had done to Steer before. Speaking of Ja-in, since the bombing had stopped, Okja was having an easy time evacuating everyone from the battlefield. Despite being rescued by Ja-in, Donald still had a concern in her heart, Lee-Su. She asked Ja-in about Lee-Su, and Ja-in assured her that they would rescue Lee-Su, which was exactly what Donald wanted to hear. However, currently, they didn't know where Lee-Su was, so Donald was curious about how Ja-in planned to rescue her. Faced with Donald's worries, Ja-in didn't know how to answer because, even if they knew Lee-Su's location, he wasn't currently a match for Steer, which was the reality. But before that, they all needed to survive. So the current destination for everyone would be the East Sea, where the Kraken awaited. Although Ja-in didn't know how, he had to regain his lost strength because without it, rescuing Lee-Su would just be wishful thinking. However, life is not like a novel. Since Steer had read Ja-in like a book, it had prepared two teams to intercept their attempt to reach the East Sea. Before Ja-in and the others could react, the opposing side had their guns pointed at them, ready for a bloody showdown. Sensing something amiss, Ja-in and Okja were surprised that the enemy was attacking without warning. Trained extensively in the North Korean army, Okja immediately reacted, telling everyone to duck and turn the steering wheel to escape. Although they narrowly escaped, Okja was shocked that the enemy attacked without confirmation of their identities. As for Ja-in, even though he had lost all his strength, he still could summon, so he retaliated. Ja-in quickly rallied his allies. Through the eyes of a soldier, Steer was quite surprised to realize that its archenemy hadn't completely lost his strength. Feeling that it couldn't be gentle anymore, a fighter jet suddenly appeared from above and swiftly approached Okja's vehicle. Just as Okja saw the pile of missiles it carried, she immediately told everyone to get out of the car and run away. Thanks to Okja's quick thinking, they managed to escape the car just before it exploded. Feeling relieved that everyone was okay, Ja-in turned his gaze towards the soldiers and suddenly realized amidst the chaos that there's still one person pointing a gun. And according to the direction of this person's shooting, it wasn't aiming at Ja-in. Okja was the chosen target. With just a split-second delay, Okja would fall into the trap, so before that happened, Ja-in had to shield the little girl with his own body. As for Okja, she was still dazed by the explosion, so she was shocked to see her big brother Ja-in falling from being shot instead of herself. With Ja-in, it was clear that he no longer could withstand bullets, so lying down after eating the candy copper was inevitable. Right at this moment, Ja-in was following the very way his mother had protected him when he was young. And like his mother, death was now creeping up on Ja-in. Everything seemed chaotic, but Jain couldn't hear anything anymore. Despite having died countless times before, this was still a strange feeling that Jain had yet to adapt to for a long time. Jain viewed death as a cycle of life, a law of nature that wasn't important. Because Jain had never truly died. But right now, at the moment when Jain could finally embrace death as originally hoped, he didn't want to bid farewell. Li Su was still waiting for Jain to come to the rescue, so he wanted to keep living to protect those he loved. After all, it seemed Steer's words were right. Jain might be a super being, but he was still just a normal human. Nevertheless, because they were just ordinary people, neither Okja nor Donald could do anything for Jain except try to wake him up. However, the enemy was still there, and both sides were limited in strength, including Okja and Donald, who could only watch helplessly as Jain was dragged away without resistance. After securing the situation with the soldiers, they cautiously approached to see if Jain was truly dead. Only when they saw him lying motionless in a pool of blood could they feel somewhat relieved. On Donald's side, seeing his once strong friend now lying lifeless in a pool of blood brought tears to her eyes. The pain and despair made Donald cry in mourning for her friend Jain. On the other hand, Steer was quite satisfied with the outcome, as the only one who could hinder it was now dead without much effort. However, for every happy person, there is also a sad one. Steer was once again surprised when it saw Li Su shedding tears for his best friend. Back at where Jain fell, the bird attack had been smoothly dealt with by the army. Meanwhile, Okja could only watch as Jain was placed in a coffin and prepared to be taken away. As for Jain, everyone thought he had departed from the mortal world, but in reality, Jain was only at the threshold of death. At this moment, countless words were echoing in his head, ranging from primitive creatures 40 billion years ago to present-day humans. Jain had experienced many lifetimes, but throughout those long years, he had always wondered why he had to go through this cycle. Right now, the question in Jain's mind was, why did nature give him strength? And why was he losing it now? For countless millennia, Jain still couldn't truly know what he was. Countless questions lingered until this moment. Jain still had no answers. After remembering his friends and what Steer had said, it was clear that both he and Steer were judges with the power to decide humanity's fate. Jain was extremely angry, he truly despised humans. But Jain's motivation wasn't a judgment, it was revenge, it was unleashing his anger for all he had endured, it was a massacre. Innocents are selfishly slaughtered. Jain had once contemplated the extinction of humanity. He had also been judged by them. But after experiencing many life events in the form of a human being, Jain realized that there were still many good people out there, like his mother. 2 hunters. Little Okja, Donald, and especially his best friend Li Su. For the first time, Jain lived the life of a human, a weak human, with worries and fears. Nevertheless, he still had to move forward to face a life full of contradictions, from birth until now. Jain had received love, and he had given love to those close to him. Thinking about this, Jain finally understood that this endless cycle was his objective evaluation of his life experiences. Therefore, Jain had to choose from the will of something. Having enlightenment and finding the answer to the question of who he was. Jain had returned from the brink of death to earth, startling Steer. Immediately, a familiar source of power emanated from the coffin. In contrast to the soldier's extreme surprise, little Okja appeared very happy. As for Donald, even though tears were still streaming down her face, her sorrow seemed to have washed away. Because right now, Jain could open the coffin and return. And stronger than ever. Finally, Jain could be sure that he had found the answer for himself. Returning to Steer, things seemed to be getting more troublesome now that the adversary he thought he had defeated had returned. In this lifetime, only Jain was Steer's archenemy, and only he was the one that made Steer feel fear, so the nightmare named Jain had to end. Steer immediately ordered the commander to command the troops to shoot down Jain. Facing the sight of a whole battalion pointing their guns at Jain, both Donald and Okja were quite worried. However, nobody bathes twice in the same river, so despite the enemy raining bullets like a storm, Jain remains unfazed. Yet Jain didn't show any anger or annoyance after all the people shooting at him were innocent, including the soldiers he had once commanded. He thought that way because he believed he had the right to judge. Ultimately, that thought just rationalized Jain's actions. In the face of his friends' concerns and the people pointing guns at him, Jain just wanted to apologize because even though he didn't want to, he had to harm those he didn't know to protect his friends. Yet, this was also the answer Jain wanted to give to Steer, that he and his adversary were not alike as Steer had claimed. Back at the battlefield, although the road surface had cracked after Jain's attack, no soldier had lost their life. Seeing Jain's blood-stained back, Donald and Okja were somewhat relieved as the power had returned to the rebellious child. As for Jain, despite regaining his strength, it seemed things had gone too far. He understood that he didn't have much time left, so this would be his final battle to save Li Su before bidding farewell. After all, the wars between Steer and Ja-in were unavoidable because Steer wanted to exterminate humanity while Ja-in didn't. With eyes that had observed the world for millennia, Ja-in could perceive everything in his sight. The world was maintained by a balance like a miracle, and humans were a mistake for breaking that balance. Ja-in had always believed he was born to correct that mistake and restore the world to its original form. However, Ja-in now realized that he had been too arrogant. The mistake wasn't humanity but himself. Balance or judgment for someone was all nonsense. Right now, Ja-in had found the answer to his existence. It wasn't for the earth or all beings, nor was it to judge humanity. The only reason Ja-in wanted to exist now was for Li Su, the most important person to him after his late mother. On the other side, Ja-in's existence was a thorn in Steer's side, so there was no need for a reason because only Ja-in's death would make Steer stop feeling uneasy. Surrounded by artillery and countless fighter jets soaring in the sky, Ja-in was ready to shed blood to keep his promise that he would exist for Li Su. So Ja-in could only send an apology to those attacking him because right now, he had used his power and swept a straight line forward. With that, the fighter jets in the sky exploded, and the tanks returned to the ground in the truest sense. At the South Korean military headquarters, they were still constantly exchanging information about the defense fronts. However, things seemed to have gone out of control when a soldier reported that the entire Dongtan defense line had just reported that they couldn't fight anymore. The old commander immediately felt that something was amiss. Instantly, he asked why there was such a strange report. The soldier explained that the Dongtan defense area had been attacked by Ja-in, so they couldn't fight anymore. However, luckily, there were no casualties. Hearing this, the old commander was startled to realize that Ja-in had now breached the Dongtan defense line and was rapidly advancing toward Seoul. On another front, Steer was equally displeased with this turn of events. Returning to the defense lines on the way to Seoul, Ja-in and his allies were still advancing with unstoppable momentum, disregarding the enemy's numbers or weaponry. For Ja-in, a mere gesture of his hand was enough to make everyone step aside and allow Okja to showcase her unstoppable driving skills. Whether following orders from higher-ups or, more accurately, from Steer, the troops were simply following orders without a heart. If the infantry couldn't do anything, Steer would send in the Air Force. However, unlike previous times, to stop Ja-in, instead of firing bullets, Steer manipulated the soldiers to crash the aircraft directly into Okja's vehicle. As Steer's arm descended, so did the command. Immediately, the fighter jet dove straight towards Okja's vehicle, causing Okja and Donald to panic. But whatever was difficult, Ja-in had it covered. From atop the vehicle, he flew straight towards the fighter jet. In doing so, Ja-in sacrificed himself to stop the involuntary suicide of the soldier being manipulated below. Okja, with her quick reflexes and agile maneuvering, managed to evade the collision in time. As for Ja-in, with his extraordinary strength, he successfully intercepted the fighter jet and also spared the pilot's life. Steer had a countermeasure at this moment. It wanted to see if Ja-in could continue saving 10 fighter jets simultaneously. This move of Steer made it difficult for Ja-in. Despite wanting to save the people, Ja-in could only refuse Steer's challenge and let the unfortunate pilots commit suicide. Fed up with trying to defeat Ja solo and failing to attack with human wave tactics, Steer now had to resort to the worst weapons ever created by humans. Thinking of nuclear weapons made Steer even more uncomfortable. Although it didn't remember its date of birth, according to human records, Steer might have been created by radioactive materials. That's probably why Steer didn't care much about using nuclear weapons. Moreover, Steer was currently inhabiting Li Su's body. So, if Ja-in were to reach it, Steer wouldn't mind much because Ja-in wouldn't be able to harm its friend. Returning to Ja-in, after a long and arduous journey, Okja finally brought them to the city of Seoul, where Li Su was waiting for Ja-in to rescue her. As for Ja-in, he was also prepared to embrace death to end everything. As for Steer, after all the efforts to destroy and stop Ja-in, the enemy had finally arrived right in front of it. However, knowing for sure that the enemy couldn't kill it, Steer remained quite calm. Yet, Steer was also pondering its inherent ability. It could move to another host to escape, but if it did so, Steer would lose its immunity. However, after spending a month on Red Island, Li Su's body had also begun to adapt to the cells of Steer, so if the battle couldn't be resolved soon, Steer would likely encounter major problems right now. It could be seen that Li Su's consciousness was gradually slipping further from its control. Over time, as Ja-in approached closer to Steer's location, Li Su's resistance became even more fierce. Outside, the fighter jet squadron sent by Steer continued to rain bullets to impede Ja-in's advance. And as always, a few pieces of candy-coated lead were not enough to scratch the itch. The pilot immediately launched a missile towards the vehicle. Knowing that the enemy was directly attacking Donla and Okja, Jia-in instantly transferred his strength into the vehicle to shield both from the missile's aerial onslaught. Upon witnessing the explosion, the soldiers were somewhat startled to realize that behind the billowing smoke, Jia-in's main characters were still intact. It was a close call. Both Donla and Okja almost met their demise. Conversely, despite being quite exhausted, Jia-in remained extremely calm amidst the recent events. Quickly analyzing the situation, instead of exerting efforts to defend the vehicle, Jia-in proactively launched an attack to gain the upper hand against the soldiers with his overwhelming strength. In no time, Jia-in had cleared out the first fighter jet. Simultaneously, through his power transfer skill, he successfully saved the lives of those trying to kill him. With a broken jet available, Jia-in promptly seized the opportunity to turn its debris into weapons, bidding farewell to the South Korean military's metal flies with a flick of his hand. Okja was still driving at a very high speed. Thanks to this, when Jia-in fell, Okja promptly caught his elder brother. As for the army, thanks to Jia-in's protection, they remained unharmed despite the exploding fighter jets. However, due to dispersing his strength to protect the opponent, Jia-in's body was overwhelmed. No strength is infinite. And Jia-in was no exception. An hour later, after leaving Donla and Okja behind, Jia-in had come very close to Li Su's location. Nevertheless, he was also weary of using a considerable amount of strength. In this life, the person Jia-in cherished the most was his mother. But since she was no longer in this world, the sole reason for Jia-in to continue living as a human was Li Su. Therefore, right now, no matter how numerous the opponent was or how well equipped, Jia-in was ready to play ruthlessly to reach his friend. The scene now was truly horrifying. On the ground, the South Korean troops were as numerous as ants. Moreover, countless fighter jets were ready for combat above. After all, despite not wanting to harm anyone, in this situation, Jia-in had to fight back to protect himself. Furthermore, Jia-in had no right to judge anyone, so before taking action, he wanted to apologize to everyone. In the end, whatever would come, when the commander's order was given, it was time for the battle between the two sides to erupt. Before the enemy's opening shot to avoid casualties, Jia-in immediately unleashed his power and forcefully stomped the ground. This action caused the surrounding earth to quake, simultaneously creating a natural shield of dirt and rocks to protect himself and the soldiers who had been knocked out earlier. A while later, after ensuring the safety of the innocent soldiers, Jia-in once again activated his strength to move forward. Despite the enemy soldiers still raining bullets like rain, Jia-in swiftly dashed out from inside the fortress he had created, moving at an incredible speed, ignoring the attacking soldiers. The only thing Jia-in cared about now was his friend, Li Su, so like a lightning bolt, he soared through numerous buildings to reach where Steer was waiting. As for Steer, it was also ready for a confrontation with Jia-in. Right now, the destiny between Jia-in, an all-powerful creature that had existed for 50 billion years, and Steer, a product of insatiable human greed, would end right here. It could be said that both were enemies of humanity before, but now Jia-in would fight for Li Su, for humanity, and himself. Originally, the existence of both was a mistake, so before the end of his life cycle, Jia-in was determined to destroy Steer, the entity that could endanger Li Su and the balance of the planet where he was born. And here ends this part. See you in the next installment. Peace.